Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Gray. I am the Public Services Coordinator of FSCJ Library and Learning Commons, and I want to thank you for joining us today for Hit the Road, Yellow Jack, the International Dimensions of the 1888 Yellow Fever Epidemic. A couple things before we get started, just housekeeping. You are all muted. I do force mute everyone when they come on in. That is in deference to our speakers because it is much easier for them to focus and concentrate on the content they have to deliver to you today if they don't have to worry about you talking on the phone or chewing or popping up with questions. We will have time for questions at the end. You can put them in the chat in the meantime, and I will get to them at the end of the event. We do also ask that you turn off your videos if you're not presenting today, just out of courtesy as well. And with that said, we will go ahead and get started. By the late 1800s, Jacksonville had become a mecca for tourists, with upwards of 60,000 visitors descending upon the city annually. In the summer of 1888, one of these visitors, known familiarly as Yellow Jack, proved entirely unwelcome. The yellow fever epidemic that year ground Jacksonville to a halt and saw newspapermen dying at their desks and brides taking ill at the altar. But what precisely is yellow fever, and how does Jacksonville's epidemic fit into the broader context of the disease both nationally and internationally? Here to explore these questions today are Professor of Biological Sciences, Dr. Lourdes Norman-McKay, and Professor of History, Dr. Maureen McCormick. Dr. Norman-McKay, take it away.
Sure. If you could advance to our first slide, please. Okay, so yellow fever has been around for a long time, at least 3,000 years. For most of its early history, this virus would have affected people living in the rainforest climates of Africa. But as global shipping expanded and as slaves from Africa were brought to the Americas, the virus spread to the New World, and that was through the 1600s. And then in 1927, the virus that causes yellow fever was finally isolated from people. Now, at the start of an infection, the virus triggers flu-like symptoms, fever, chills, headache, fatigue. Some of you are probably familiar with those signs and symptoms. And then as the virus starts replicating, making more of itself in the patient's kidneys and liver, other symptoms can develop. For example, back pain can result as the virus starts to replicate in the kidneys. And in about 15% of cases, the patient progresses to a severe form of the disease that features jaundice and then can also progress to organ failure. Next slide, please. Jaundice develops when a person's bilirubin levels become elevated. So what is bilirubin? Well, it's a substance that the body makes when red blood cells are broken down. And when red blood cells are broken down in large quantities, as happens during yellow fever, bilirubin levels can increase to a dangerous level. Because it has a yellow color, as its concentration in the bloodstream increases, the patient's skin might become slightly yellowed. And as you see in this photograph, the sclera, which is the white region of the eye, can also take on a yellow color. Next slide, please. So how do people get yellow fever? As it happens, a mosquito vector is needed to spread the virus from person to person. The virus has a maturation stage in the mosquito, so it's not as though a mosquito would bite an infected person and then immediately transmit the virus to the next person it bit. Furthermore, not just any mosquito suffices. The virus prefers a specific species of mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And this insect is not native to the Western Hemisphere. Rather, it was imported on slave ships, most likely in barrels of water that would have been stored on board those ships. Because you have this time distance between transmission of this virus, the association between mosquitoes and yellow fever wasn't made until a bit later, and actually in the late 1800s, around 1881, when the Cuban physician Carlos Finlay suggested that mosquitoes transmitted the disease. And although Finlay was correct in his findings, his findings were largely ignored for nearly 20 years until Major Walter Reed, a U.S. Army surgeon, and a commission that he led confirmed Finlay's findings around the year 1900. And then in 1938, we finally have a vaccine against this virus. So the vaccine combined with mosquito control has been very effective, so much so that we don't worry about getting yellow fever here in the US anymore. However, it's not an eradicated disease. There are still cases of it. It's endemic still in parts of Africa and South America. Next slide, please. Of course, yellow fever and many other mosquito-borne infections like malaria, Zika, chikungunya, dengue, and a lot of others can reemerge wherever this mosquito thrives. And we need to keep mosquito populations in check because of that. It's a hugely important public health measure, and it's something that's becoming more challenging as we face global warming. As you look at this graph, you can see there are two lines. The red line assumes that we proceed as normal and don't address carbon emissions, and we see an increase in global temps of about 4 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas the blue line shows the projection for these mosquito populations. If we meet our goals, we reduce carbon emissions such that global temperatures don't rise more than about 2 degrees Celsius, or roughly 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you think 1 degree isn't a big deal, just imagine how your own physiology is affected when your body temperature is increased by a degree. You feel it. And similarly for mosquitoes, when ambient temperatures rise even by a little bit, they can extend their breeding season and thereby significantly increase their population numbers. And again, as the data show here, this is already happening, but the degree to which it happens in the future, we can affect that based on how we approach global warming. And if you look at the next slide, you can see the range of where these mosquitoes can thrive also expands with the scenario pictured on the right showing the future in about 80 years if we continue business as usual in terms of our carbon emissions. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, looking back at 1888 when yellow fever struck Jacksonville, the Aedes aegypti mosquito is well established throughout the Southeast. But remember, at that time, the idea of mosquito transmission is not widely known. And even among those who know of this theory, it's not widely accepted. So this means people have all sorts of ideas about how to prevent disease. They suggest sprinkling mercury bichloride, which is a toxin, by the way, into the streets. It doesn't work. Destroy the germs by concussion. That's a great one. You just basically shoot a bunch of guns in the air and all the reverberations through the air, that should kill the virus. Of course, they don't know it's a virus yet, but it'll kill the germ. A man from Lodi wrote to the Times-Union and suggested that maybe we could loft a massive air balloon equipped with a steam engine. Of course, that makes it special. Loft that above the city. That'll draw the cold air down, generate a frost on the streets of Jacksonville, and that should kill the germs. That would eradicate the fever. They also like to set a lot of things on fire. Pine and tar, you can see it in the picture here, these pine and tar barrels burning. They like to burn blankets of victims and things that the person may have come in contact with, again, not understanding how this was transmitted. And then they also set up quarantine camps and drained standing water. Those last two, of course, being among the more effective measures. Next slide, please. And treatments were also quite bizarre and varied. Bloodletting, of course, that was always a go-to. Let's bleed them and see if that works. Or perhaps you could sit near a hot stove and draw all the fever out. I'm sure that that would have been really enjoyable in the summer in Jacksonville. And then if that doesn't work, maybe a pinch of sulfur in your shoes every day could keep the fever away. Not an apple a day, just a pinch of sulfur in your shoes. Purgatives, so these are things that will either lead to a bowel movement or vomiting, and 10 grains of calomel, which is that toxic mercury bichloride, delivered in a dose of oil. That was a standard therapy for a purgative. Giving cathartic pills, which basically equate to sugar pills with some chamomile in them, more or less. A hot foot bath with or without mustard and salt, a little seasoning, that could help. Alexander Hamilton was advised by his physician to take a cold bath, drink Madeira wine and hot brandy, and eat lots of Peruvian bark. And the Peruvian bark probably would have worked to lower fever because it contained a quinine in it, which would have helped address some of the fever aspects. The Times-Union suggested a diet light in meat and also light in alcohol, lots of vegetables and coffee. Oh, and you should smoke, which of course you should not do. And today, of course, there's still not a cure, but as previously mentioned, we do have vaccines to prevent disease. And then next slide for me, please. All right. Good news is if you do recover from yellow fever, you're going to have lifelong immunity. And so these immunity cards were issued to allow freedom of travel. And with that, I'll hand it over to the history aspect for my esteemed colleague, Dr. McCormick.
Thank you. Thank you, Lourdes. And thank you to both Lourdes and Jennifer for inviting me to participate today. I wanted to share with you first an image of what Jacksonville looked like shortly before this epidemic erupted. And Jacksonville was considering itself in 1886 to be the gateway to the South. It is a growing city, it is a bustling seaport, a bustling riverport, and it has a railroad terminus in 1886 as well. And you can see that activity in what is literally an expanding city. That is depicted here, although confined to what is now the north bank of the St. Johns River. Two other images to again suggest the rapidity with which Jacksonville was growing in the late 19th century are the image on the left, which is a map of Jacksonville in 1876 that can be compared with Jacksonville in 1893. Both again are depicting the riverport, the seaport, but the image on the left of 1876, we really do see a smaller area that constitutes down Jacksonville itself that has expanded within 20 years. And that expansion is not unrelated to the yellow fever, interestingly enough. So this is a city that's growing. It's growing with an influx of people, which is important. The fact that people are not necessarily from Jacksonville, but living here when yellow fever erupts in 1888. It's a city that is looking forward to greater economic expansion, is celebrating its economic expansion and that of the state of Florida with an enormous Sub-Tropical Exposition held in Jacksonville in the winter and early spring of 1888. This Sub-Tropical Exposition showcases all that Florida has to offer to the nation, from the citrus fruits to strawberries to agricultural productivity that can be found here. This is showcasing advertising Florida to the United States. And certainly President Grover Cleveland is going to pay a visit in February of 1888 to see Florida on display. What's allowing for Florida to grow is, on the one hand, its location. Florida is a warm winter destination that has begun to attract tourists, and the tourists that are arriving are going to swell the winter population of a city like Jacksonville. And tourism is certainly booming in the 1870s. But by 1881, there's another element that's expanding the population and the economy of Jacksonville, as well as the state of Florida, and that is the Waycross Short Line. Now, the Waycross Short Line is a railroad linkage between Jacksonville and Waycross, Georgia. And I've circled Jacksonville in green on this map, and Waycross, Georgia is circled in red on this map, and it's a railway map itself. These two locations are important because to really leave Florida by train, you're going to go through Jacksonville, travel through Callahan, Florida, and then to Waycross, Georgia. And from Waycross, Georgia, you can go pretty much anywhere in the United States. Most importantly, though, you're going to be able to travel from a city like New York to Jacksonville with only one change of train, which means you can travel in luxury aboard a Pullman car, for example, and that's going to be attractive for, again, expanding Florida's tourism as well as commerce in general. But the railroad is also going to be an element in the spread of yellow fever. So we need to keep in mind that this offers great prosperity, but also potential peril to Jacksonville as well. Yellow fever for Jacksonville is not a new phenomenon in 1888, and it's not new for the Americans. The Americans have a very long experience with yellow fever. It is something that goes back to colonial America. It's part of anecdotal stories that people tell of a seasoning that occurs when people first arrive in the Southern American colonies. And the seasoning is such that people in the first summer season will encounter any one of a variety of fevers, sometimes not always well diagnosed or well described, with the general understanding that should you be seasoned and survive a summer season in low-lying coastal areas of the American South, that you are pretty much then going to be assured of surviving other fevers as well. This is, in effect, what we would call becoming immune to diseases like yellow fever as a consequence of being exposed to it and surviving. In 1793, there is a major yellow fever epidemic that occurs in Philadelphia. And one of the reasons why this yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia is shocking is A, it's not a southern city, but B, Philadelphia was the young nation's capital in 1793. And I want to take a moment just to say something about this, because this yellow fever in 1793 Philadelphia is a manifestation of the fact that yellow fever is not new in American history when it arrives in Jacksonville. But in 1793, this epidemic bears some of the key hallmarks of most epidemics of the early 19th century. It's going to include the arrival of yellow fever to a port city, usually with immigrants fleeing from a place of violence and upheaval, such as the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is going to explain the yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia. It's going to be a localized phenomenon, though. And the second feature of being localized is because while the people of Philadelphia are going to respond to yellow fever by fleeing as quickly as they can, they're only going to be able to go so far. And because they can only go so far, most of the impact of yellow fever is really going to be contained within the city of Philadelphia itself, making this a localized experience. When we get to the mid to late 19th century, that experience is going to be transformed by the railroads. And the best place in which to see this occurring is with an outbreak of yellow fever that occurs in New Orleans in 1878. And the timing here of New Orleans in 1878 has two key manifestations to it. One, you have refugees coming from Cuba's violence. A mid-century war that had just taken place in Cuba has brought Cuban refugees, it is believed, and yellow fever to New Orleans. Two, in 1878, there's been a political change in New Orleans, and some of the stringent quarantining and sanitation measures associated with the previous political government of the Republicans has been eased. Potentially therefore allowing yellow fever to arrive. But when yellow fever outbreak occurs in New Orleans in 1878, and the residents of New Orleans do what they always do with a yellow fever outbreak and flee north, flee to the interior. They're going to flee to cities like Memphis, which have historically welcomed them, but this time they're often fleeing by train. And because they're fleeing by train, they're able to leave New Orleans without manifesting any symptoms of yellow fever, and even arrive in Memphis without manifesting yellow fever, and therefore be welcomed, and thereby spread yellow fever. While Memphis itself is going to experience 5,000 dead from yellow fever, the entire Mississippi Valley region will have a casualty rate of 20,000 from this epidemic, because it is going to be spread by yellow fever itself. This means that the railroads are transforming the American experience of yellow fever from something that's highly localized to something that could dominate a region or even the nation. The railroad is most definitely going to be a key feature here, as is the steamships that are bringing people to American ports. Because again, you can leave a foreign port such as Havana, Cuba, and arrive in New Orleans not manifesting yellow fever, and still then transmit it, however. When the yellow fever outbreak occurs in Jacksonville in 1888, the first reported case is July 28th. It's a man by the name of Richard McCormick, no relation to me. He has just arrived by train from Tampa, and it is generally believed that yellow fever arrived in Tampa from a ship that came from Havana, Cuba. And so again, you've got the steamship travel, you've got the train, new modes of faster forms of transportation that are facilitating the spread of this very deadly and horrific disease. But that first case is reported as sporadic. There's a couple of more cases, again, reported as sporadic. But by the 10th of August, it can't be denied, epidemic that yellow fever is in fact epidemic in the city of Jacksonville, and the reaction is going to be fairly immediate in terms of how people respond to this crisis. Now, the epidemic itself is going to continue through the remainder of the summer, throughout the fall, and by early December, it is going to be declared to be over. And by mid-December, the residents of Jacksonville who have fled will be allowed back into the city itself. But the city is most definitely going to be traumatized by this experience. The first reaction of many people in the city of Jacksonville is again going to be attempting to flee. On the other hand, we need to think about how the rest of Florida responds to this crisis and how the rest of the nation responds to this crisis as well. Atlantic seaports are going to immediately announce a quarantine against ships arriving from Jacksonville, which means that you can't take a ship out of Jacksonville and sail to New York. They won't admit that ship into the city. Well, what about taking a train out of Jacksonville? That also is going to be a problem. And it's also going to be a problem because the local towns around this area are going to quarantine against Jacksonville as well. They're not going to hesitate in their response. It's going to be immediate, and it's going to be quite vociferous. It's going to be what is called shotgun quarantining that's taking place here. The community of New Berlin, just located north of the St. Johns River, which is not actually a town, is going to go through the mechanism of incorporating itself just to create a board of health and then thereby announce that they are quarantined against Jacksonville. St. Augustine announces a quarantine against Jacksonville, reinforced by 250 armed guards paid for by the railroad and hotel developer Henry Flagler. And to be fair, Jacksonville has earlier, with other epidemics that took place in St. Augustine, quarantined against St. Augustine as well. Palatka, a railroad junction, is refusing a shipment of grain that has passed through the city of Jacksonville. The city of Ocala demands that any train passing through must go at a minimum speed of 20 miles per hour because you wouldn't want any of those yellow fever germs to somehow fall off the train and be caught by somebody that's living in Ocala. But this is the shotgun quarantining that's taken place that will make it difficult for Jacksonvillians to flee this epidemic itself. Probably the two most significant responses, though, come from the communities of Waycross, Georgia, and Callahan, Florida. Now, Callahan is a very small town today as well as then. There's very few people who live in Callahan, but the train from Jacksonville to Waycross goes through Callahan, and it meets up with other trains coming from points south in Florida. That means that people will be changing trains in some cases at Callahan, and Callahan does not want any trains coming from Jacksonville and threatens that if the railroad company does not stop the trains, that the people of Callahan will literally pull up the tracks, is what they're claiming. They're going to be taking on not a board of health, not just the city of Jacksonville, they're taking on the railroad corporations at this point in time. And the town of Waycross is also going to impose a quarantine against Jacksonville. Waycross is also a small town, but again, in terms of railroad, it is going to be tremendously significant, and Waycross refuses to allow any of these remaining trains that leave Jacksonville to actually allow passengers to disembark. They demand that the windows be closed, nobody can get off, do not give those people food and water, make sure they just pass on through without leaving the train, as this illustration from Frank Leslie's magazine is going to demonstrate. So the people of Jacksonville can't leave by ship. Their ability to leave by train is cut off because of the people of Callahan and Waycross imposing this quarantine upon the city. This is a problem. How do you resolve this? What do you do about this crisis that Jacksonville is experiencing? Especially since, as Lourdes has already indicated, there is no cure for yellow fever. There is no cure. The best thing is not to catch yellow fever itself. What the city will do, or rather a voluntary association in the city is going to do, is create a couple of what are called refugee camps to detain people. And so they establish an organized process whereby people, primarily white Jacksonvillians, because some of these camps will deny admittance to African Americans, these people can take up residence at a camp located at a distance from Jacksonville. Camp Perry, for example, is located at the St. Mary's River, about 40 miles north of Jacksonville. You stay there for 10 days. Conditions are horrible. You're living either in a leaky tent or a small cabin, as this illustration would suggest, communal kitchens. And then after 10 days, if you're not sick, you can then leave the vicinity and pass unencumbered, because it's been certified that you're not a carrier for yellow fever at that point in time. And people are going to be encouraged to leave Jacksonville. The solution that Jacksonville really arrives at is going to be the best thing to do is make sure there's as few people here to catch yellow fever as possible. But the people who do remain in the city, and there will be, the city had about 20,000 people at the start of the epidemic. By mid-September, there's just under 14,000 people remaining in the city, most of whom, just under 10,000 of whom are going to be African American. Business grinds to a halt. Unemployment is supposedly rife at this point in time. The city is, quite frankly, destitute, and most definitely a stricken city, as it is going to be called. And it is a city that's going to experience, as the slide suggests, just under 5,000 recorded cases of yellow fever and 427 recorded deaths from yellow fever. Again, really taking place amongst the people who remain in the city of Jacksonville at this point after mid-September. The fact that you have this enormous disparity in the population of Jacksonville suggests one of the consequences that will take place in the city of Jacksonville because of yellow fever outbreak. One of the casualties, aside from the almost 500 people who died, one of the casualties is going to be self-government. And self-government becomes a casualty of this epidemic because just prior to the epidemic, when Jacksonville held its municipal elections, the people of Jacksonville elected a Republican mayor and Republican-dominated city council at a time when the Democratic Party, associated with the antebellum South, associated with conservative politics, Jacksonville elected a Republican mayor and city council when the Republican Party was associated with African Americans and the party of Abraham Lincoln. This was considered to be an evil situation, according to one early Jacksonville historian, T. Frederick Davis. And it's going to be replicated when there's another election in the midst of the epidemic, because there's a national election taking place in the fall of 1888. And in the fall of 1888, with a population of 14,000 people, most of whom are African American, the city of Jacksonville overwhelmingly votes Republican in that election. When the epidemic is over, the state legislature of Florida passes a law that allows for the city government of Jacksonville to be disbanded, and that allows for the governor of Florida to appoint the city council, which then in turn will elect a mayor, a Democrat, to be the mayor of Jacksonville. This situation remains in place until 1893, when self-government's reestablished, but it's one of the events that allows for the city government of Jacksonville to eventually become an all-white government and a democratically controlled government by 1907. This consequence of the yellow fever really complicates one of the major stories of American history, in which we generally say that after Reconstruction ends in 1877, Florida becomes once again a democratically controlled party and African Americans are disenfranchised. African Americans are not immediately disenfranchised, and instead what we're seeing here is the long, slow, protracted process by which that disenfranchisement occurs, and the mechanisms that are used for that disenfranchisement to occur as well. The afflicted city of Jacksonville, as this illustration from a major national magazine depicts, may have been isolated when the rail service was restricted, and the railroads will cut off access to Jacksonville. But donations solicited by relief committees located around the United States, in some cases hosted by Jacksonvillians who fled, these relief committees are going to raise funds to help the city of Jacksonville, who is depicted here in this image as the afflicted sister who is wounded, clutching her left breast, but shielded by the donations coming from cities such as New York, very prominently displayed, as well as Atlanta, Macon, Chicago, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and so forth, all major railroad cities themselves. One of the consequences, aside from the loss of self-government for Jacksonville, that we see with the yellow fever epidemic is the issue of what do you do about yellow fever? How do you coordinate a response to yellow fever when yellow fever is no longer going to be a localized problem? Throughout the South, we see that State Board of Health established in southern states, with the exception of Florida, as a response to the Memphis 1878 yellow fever epidemic. But in 1878, Florida was not well connected economically and in terms of railroad to the rest of the country, and Florida doesn't establish a Board of Health until the yellow fever epidemic of 1888. And when it does create a Board of Health for itself, its director of the Board of Health is going to be amongst those individuals who vociferously resist any national efforts to coordinate or centralize public health in the United States, in particular regards to a national system of quarantining, which is going to really die at the hands of states' rights advocates, despite the juxtaposition that we see in this image on the right on the screen, in which Athena Hygieia is dueling against Yellowjack. The other major consequence, another consequence that comes from this, which really emerges from the fact that, again, we don't get a national response to creating a national system of quarantining, is that instead we see that the American narrative of yellow fever is going to shift overseas. The American narrative of yellow fever, in fact, shifts to Cuba, the home country of Carlos Finlay, already mentioned by Lourdes, in terms of the person responsible for identifying mosquito as the vector for yellow fever. And the story shifts to Cuba because in 1898, the United States is going to declare war on Spain, as Cuba is fighting for independence from Spain in 1898. And the question of how to coordinate a national response really gets lost at that point in time, because the question then becomes how to stop the arrival of yellow fever in the United States without interrupting shipping. And the way to do that is to not need to have to quarantine any ships coming from a port such as Havana. So what occurs in 1898? Well, 1898, American emotions are running very high about the situation in Cuba prior to the American declaration of war. And as the possibility of war over Cuba looms, some Americans are actually saying it would be a good idea to go into Cuba, if only to impose sanitary measures to prevent yellow fever spreading to the United States. The American decision to join the war hinges upon more than the disease. But we can't forget the fact that in this war, most of the American casualties are going to die from disease and not from warfare itself. And that's where we see the American military occupation of Cuba focused very heavily upon what they consider to be mosquito eradication, methods of sanitation to prevent the spread of yellow fever. And despite their best efforts, the American military is not able to eradicate the mosquito and is not able to curb yellow fever, although the mosquito population is diminished. that then lends credibility to focusing upon Finlay's earlier work, and Finlay's work in conjunction with Walter Reed Walter Reed's experiments are going to be validated. And when it's validated and the mosquito is firmly identified as the vector, that then becomes the focus of attention. But the American focus for coordinating a response shifts from trying to get the various states to come into any sort of agreement, and instead focus upon getting Latin American countries that are susceptible to yellow fever to coming into an agreement. And that's what the Americans are going to do when they begin to organize the forerunner to the Organization of American States, which is going to take on the issue of facilitating the flow of information for commerce at their very first meeting. And at their second meeting, they're going to decide upon finding some way to coordinate public health measures and information, which would again facilitate commerce between these countries. This Pan-American approach to public health is one that will alleviate southern cities of the burden of quarantining without sacrificing local control, which is what the city of Callahan had vociferously opposed. Any effort to sacrifice their local control of what happens in their particular community. The Pan-American focus is also going to address the problem of rapid travel times that have allowed someone to travel internationally before presenting symptoms of yellow fever. Lourdes?
So, as Dr. McCormick mentioned, mosquito control became a really important aspect of keeping yellow fever at bay. And we still use mosquito control today as part of our really important public health measures. And just in the state of Florida alone, we spend at least $160 million per year on lowering our mosquito population. As you know, we're not eradicating them. We're just lowering their populations, and only after they reach a certain level do we go and spray for them. We still monitor for outbreaks of mosquito-borne infections, and there are a number of them in Florida. Dengue, for example, for a while there we were watching Zika and chikungunya. And yellow fever does still occur in parts of the world, fortunately not endemic here in the United States at this point, but it still kills about 30,000 people per year, and there are at least 200,000 cases of it on average globally. So it's still alive and well. And remember, you need two ingredients basically to lead to wider spread transmission of yellow fever. You have to have infected people and the mosquito vector. And when you bring those two things together, you have set the stage for a possible outbreak or epidemic. And the nice thing here in the United States is we do not have a lot of monkeys running around, non-human primates, so we don't get these jungle cycles that perpetuate the existence of yellow fever. That's what happens in some of the tropical regions, subtropical regions that you see in Africa and Latin America, where this virus is endemic and continues to cause problems. So you'll see next time you see a measure on mosquito control, or you see a mosquito truck going around and spraying, or you see about the budget cuts that might be coming down that might affect mosquito control, just remember, mosquitoes are deadly. They spread a lot of diseases, and Jacksonville is not immune to them. So thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this interesting topic, and thank you, Jennifer, for bringing me and Maureen together to collaborate on this.
Thank you
so much, ladies. I am going to go ahead and give everyone an opportunity to plug some questions into the chat. We did have one with question from a student asking, was there an overlap between this epidemic and the Great Fire, and did that help with the extermination of mosquitoes whatsoever?
Nice. Nice, and I understand the connection you're making there. The Great Fire will be in 1901, so there isn't an overlap between those two events.
But I'm sure the smoke during the actual Great Fire probably was not mosquito friendly, though I believe that also Great Fire was April or March?
May.
March? May.
May.
Okay, so So also a little bit earlier in the year than we normally see bad mosquitoes, I think. Fantastic. Again, I'll give everybody another second if they have questions. I will ask both of you ladies. I know that both of you did a fair amount of research for this presentation today, and I was just wondering what, if anything, that you found while you were working on this surprised you at all about this epidemic or entertained you. Did you have a favorite fact that you learned?
I don't think I had a favorite fact that I learned from this, and I'm sorry to jump in, Lourdes, but I did think that this raised a lot of questions in my mind. And I think that this subject is an opportunity for further research. And I hope that people of Jacksonville will consider taking this on as a research subject, because there's a lot of elements about the story that still needs to be told. And in particular, the stories of those people who remained in the city of Jacksonville. I don't think we have enough information about how they experienced the ravages of this disease, or of exactly how disproportionate was the impact of this disease upon certain communities in Jacksonville. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for further research and examination. And I want to point out as well that Tim Gilmore, Bill Delaney, and Andrew Pentazzi have written accounts of this that I encourage people to look at online.
In fact, can you advance to the next slide for us? I think we have some suggested reading in addition to those. So, and then Lourdes, did you have a fun fact?
So I think one of the things that was striking for me was the parallels that we see in history to what we're seeing now with another virus, and that is the wondering how something's transmitted, how can you stay safe, how can you treat it, suspicion, all the things that characterize the human condition that we don't escape even over 100 years later, and just seeing that cycle. And you can see this throughout outbreaks in history, that human behavior is pretty predictable based on past events, and we saw this recurring. So
we have another question in the chat, and it's what is the ratio of Zika victims to yellow fever victims? Which virus kills more people? So I guess which is more?
So yellow fever kills more people than Zika. The problem with Zika was more that it causes problems in the fetus. So as you might have recalled, when Zika was causing problems through Brazil, and we had a few imported cases here and through other countries as well. The main problem wasn't so much that people were dying, adults were dying for Zika, but more that when women are infected with Zika while pregnant, the developing fetus can have problems, namely microcephaly, where the brain and skull don't develop the same way they would. And the child has a smaller head than usual, and a lot of developmental abnormalities can come with that. So I would say yellow fever definitely kills more people than when we had Zika more prevalent. We haven't had a lot of Zika cases for the past 5 or 6 years. And yellow fever is actually, there's an ongoing outbreak right now in, I think it was in Nigeria. So yellow fever wins that one.
Score one for Yellow Jack. All right. We do have another question. How long did people have yellow fever before succumbing to it? So I guess what's the course of the disease in terms of time duration?
Right. So incubation period is usually 3 to 6 days, after which when the person starts to manifest symptoms, provided they develop a symptomatic case, they're sick for about 4 days, 5 days. And then only about 15% of symptomatic cases progress to the severe form of disease. And of that small subset of those 15% that become severely ill, it's estimated that about 20 to 50% of them would have died. And, that number doesn't look too different in developing countries where access to healthcare can be very difficult, and maybe not even at all accessible. Whereas mortality rates in a developed nation, let's say you travel somewhere and you contract yellow fever and you come home to your developed country with access to healthcare, your chances of surviving are excellent. But of course, the same can't be said for people who don't have access to that sort of healthcare. I mean, something as simple as, keeping your fever down, keeping you hydrated, monitoring your organ performance and so on, life-saving, not as readily accessible in places like the outskirts of the jungles in Africa, for example.
Okay, we see, we got another one. What animals in Florida do we know that can contract yellow fever? Is it just humans, or is it something that other animals can get?
So it's humans and non-human primates.
So
And
the monkeys in Silver Springs, basically.
yeah, right. I would say that would be about it. And I guess those little guys have made their way off of that little island they were initially placed on and have spread. I think we've even seen some of them around here in Jacksonville, but not widespread. And that, remember, you have to have an infected carrier. So you have to have a non-human primate or a human that is infected with yellow fever, and it has to encounter the mosquito. The mosquito has to then become infected, and that's when you set the stage for perpetuation of transmission. And because we don't have infected people running around commonly in the region, the chances of that becoming an endemic cycle, very, very low.
That
So
seems like a good place.
that's good news, right?
Yep, it's very good news. We got one more question or two more questions here, so let me get those real quick. Who's more likely to die from yellow fever? Young children, middle-aged, or the elderly?
Always when we talk about mortality rates, we think young children and the elderly, because these are the populations where immune function tends to be less rigorous. And the same holds true for yellow fever. And I saw one more, vaccination. So vaccination status, I believe immune protection is thought to be at least a decade. How do I compare yellow fever to COVID-19? Well, the yellow fever virus is an RNA virus. SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, is also an RNA virus. But yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes, whereas COVID-19 is a person-to-person transmission. And usually when we have person-to-person transmissions, especially through respiratory means like SARS-CoV-2, you can expect a much wider and broader prevalence.
If I could add something to that, one of the other differences would be in terms of how people experience this disease is that while there were hospitals in Jacksonville where people were sent when they had yellow fever, I believe some people were still at home. And so there in your home, you've got a loved one who's experiencing this hemorrhagic fever. And it is quite gruesome to experience, to see. And many of the extreme cases of COVID-19 are taking place in hospitals and really outside of our line of sight, which I think is another part of the difference between how these two things are experienced.
Good point.
Fantastic. All right. Again, thank you, ladies, so much for speaking today. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending. If you are interested in this event, please keep an eye out for additional events for the Library and Learning Commons. We are running a series of history events leading up to Jacksonville's bicentennial next summer. I believe our next event is scheduled on the 17th of November. It's going to be Professor Wes Moody, The Battle for America, How the Fight for Fort Caroline Shaped the United States. I think I've got that title right. So watch for that on our social media. We want to thank everyone again for coming today and give a round of applause for our speakers. Virtual applause. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.